25 million people. If we say SADC, we're talking about 300 million people. The FTA area, 600 million people. The continent, 1.1 billion people. Under globalization, national competitiveness is so yesterday. Under globalization, national attractiveness is so yesterday. We are now talking about regional competitiveness, regional attractiveness, continental attractiveness. How attractive is SADC? An investor in Japan does not want to know how Botswana is attractive. Is the whole region attractive? If I go to South Africa, can I get access to 200 million people? If I go to Nigeria, can I get access to the entirety of ECOWAS? South Africa cannot be attractive to investors if Zimbabwe is being misgoverned. Botswana cannot be attractive if Mozambique and Zambia are not attractive. Let us understand this, that under globalization, numbers make a difference. And by the way, the reason why the leaders don't want to integrate, they want to be a president of 2 million people, a president of 10 million people. Because, you know, if we integrate and work together, there will be one president in the continent. Mr. Mugabe, you will be the Minister of Agriculture. Are you ready? And Zuma, you're going to be the Minister of Local Government. You can see, from an ambition point of view, from a selfish point of view, these African leaders, and me included, are not ready to be called a minister, administrator, principal director, secretary. They want to be president of starving people. Let us make sure that we understand the costs of integration and the benefits of integration. Also, we need to change the way we understand measurements. GDP, per capita GDP, not enough. Think about the Gini coefficient. Think about size of middle class. Think about cell phone penetration. Think about length of tarred road. Think about power per capita. Think about water per capita. Think about the number of dams in Malawi, the number of power stations. We must measure different things that we need to run economies. Measurements and metrics that will allow us to develop the African continent are necessary. Women in Africa. Women are better leaders than men. I hope you have seen the research. So why don't we allow our women to be equal citizens and run countries? The gender dividend. When you do not empower women, you are undermining half, if not more than half, the population. It's not charity. Empowerment of women is not charity, it's smart economics. In our African agenda, let us see the space of empowering women, empowering young people, the role of technology. That's another one. You've heard the thing about technology. Technology is for Japan, it's for America. Guess what? The new technologies, wireless power, wireless telecoms, allow us to leapfrog. So why don't we as Africans leverage the ICT revolution to liberate ourselves? 21st century Pan-Africanism rooted in entrepreneurship and technology. An example, M-Pesa, mobile banking. Do you know, in the whole world, there is no better mobile payment platform than M-Pesa. In Japan, in America, they don't have anything as good as M-Pesa. Nothing. Not as good as EcoCash in Zimbabwe. Nothing in the world. You know why? Our lack of brick and mortar banking, our lack of infrastructure is an opportunity to leapfrog. Because we have no banks in Kenya, no banks in Zimbabwe, we go eco-cash, we go Mupesa, and we create global best practice. So why don't we think in this conference how we can leverage technology to bring about the Pan-African agenda and be better than Japan, better than America, better than Europe by leapfrogging? All these are opportunities. I was here basically to frame the debate, understand the definition and background of Pan-Africanism, number one. Number two, understand the achievements of Pan-Africanism. Number three, understand the failures, but more importantly, the reasons for the failures. And then, of course, the last section is, where do we go from here? And as I conclude, let me say this. You'll never be respected as an African until Africa has done well as a continent. Get that. Oprah Winfrey. Get that. Michael Jordan. Get that. Obama. As long as the African continent is not doing well, you are disrespected. No African is worthy of respect. You'll never be respected as a Ghanaian until Ghana has done well as a country. But we're talking Pan-Africanism. We must emphasize the African aspect of things. You'll never be respected as an African, whether you're a soccer star, a movie star, a president, unless every African in the diaspora is doing well. Every African on the continent is doing well. I'll give you my own personal example. I like going to Davos and speaking at Davos. So when I speak, they're like, hey, interesting. They say, where are you from? I refuse to answer. I keep talking. They say, no, we like what you're saying here at Davos in Switzerland. But where are you from? Eventually I say, hey, I'm from Zimbabwe. Ah, no, come on. You're from Zimbabwe. When are your next elections? How about corruption? No, you are not a professor of robotics and mechatronics. You're a professor of cholera. You're a professor of corruption. You're a professor of misgovernance. My own personal brand is completely clobbered by the brand of my own country. I cannot be a rock star. I cannot be a superstar unless and until my country is a superstar economy. You, as an African, can never be a superstar until the African economy is a superstar economy. I thank you so very much.
Okay, my presentation is titled Africa's Quest for Three Magic Kingdoms of Prophets, Kings, Divas, and Marabouts. Seek ye first the political kingdom, and all other things will be added unto it. Founding Ghanaian president and Pan-African prophet Kwame Nkrumah's famous injunction continues to reverberate across Africa and its diaspora 6 decades after it was first uttered. Having achieved Nkrumah's political kingdom by 1994, Africa, however, found that all other things were not added unto it. The continent is still on a painful quest for three magic kingdoms: peace and democratic governance, socio-economic transformation, and cultural equality. This griot's tale of prophets, kings, divas, and marabouts will thus focus on Africa's elusive quest to attain these three magic kingdoms. And I define divas here as goddess or supremely talented women, so it's not a term of offense. 15 years after the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85, where the rules were effectively set for the partition of Africa, something I've described in a book as the curse of Berlin, the Pan-African movement was born when Trinidadian lawyer prophet Henry Sylvester Williams organized the first Pan-African conference in London in 1900. Between 1919 and 1945, as we heard earlier, 5 Pan-African congresses took place in Europe. The meetings were at first dominated by African Americans like W.E.B. Du Bois, but in time, Africans and Caribbeans increasingly participated in them. By the time of the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945, the Pan-African movement had shifted its center of gravity and basically come home to the kind of continent. Du Bois symbolically passed the torch of Pan-Africanism to Nkrumah in Manchester, and both he, Du Bois, and another towering Pan-African intellectual prophet, Trinidad's George Padmore, then worked as advisors to Nkrumah's government in an independent Ghana, and both of them lie buried in Accra today. St. Thomas's Edward Blyden has sometimes been referred to as the father of Pan-Africanism. He championed the concept of Ethiopianism, which urged African Americans in the diaspora to return to Africa to help develop the continent. And he greatly influenced Marcus and Amy Garvey, Nkrumah, and Padmore, and his triple formulation in the 1887 classic, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race, was adopted by the Kenyan scholar Ali Mazrui when he made his 9-part documentary series, The Africans, in 1986, which is one of the most influential works ever produced on Africa. The influential idea of an African Renaissance from the late 19th century had been led by figures like Pixley Seme, Nnamdi Azikiwe, and Sheikh Anta Diop, before becoming eventually associated with Thabo Mbeki. Another South African struggle icon, Robert Sobukwe, championed non-racialism and influenced Steve Biko's Black consciousness movement. Jamaican prophet Dudley Thomas was a Pan-African lawyer who helped defend Jomo Kenyatta from British colonial rule and was also a founding member of Tanganyika's independence movement. In seeking to rebuild bridges between Africa and the diaspora, authors like African-American diva Maya Angelou, who identify deeply with the continent, are important. And one of the autobiographies described a memorable visit to Accra by Malcolm X, who also did much to mobilize African leadership in support of the struggle for civil rights in apartheid America. 2 decades later, African-American civil rights leader Randall Robinson helped to wage the anti-apartheid struggle under Trans-Africa and also to fight military rule in Haiti. Angela Davis, another African-American diva philosopher, delivered the Steve Biko annual lecture in South Africa last year, making important connections between historical struggles from the Haitian Revolution to the contemporary Black Lives Matter. Davis was inspired by the work of another prophetic Jamaican sociologist and cultural theorist, Stewart Hall, whose theory of encoding and decoding urged readers not to be passive receivers of text, particularly race prejudice in the Western media. Another prominent cultural prophet, Trinidad C.L.R. James, 1938 Black Jacobins, remains a classic of the Haitian Revolution, the bicentennial of which Thabo Mbeki attended in 2004 as the only African head of state present. Mbeki's compatriot, Ruth First, a diva, who was martyred in Mozambique by an apartheid letter bomb in 1982, devoted her life to the study of military rule across Africa and also to the activist liberation of Southern Africa. The moral philosophical foundations of Pan-African political thought and practice are also important, as will be seen in the ideas of Frantz Fanon, Steve Biko, Angela Davis, and Kwame Anthony Appiah. The OAU Charter of 1963 clearly reflected the defeat of Nkrumah's integrationist vision. The link between Pan-Africanism and civil society was broken, and the diaspora was abandoned as an ally of solidarity and development, even though decolonization and the anti-colonial struggles were assisted greatly by civic groups in the diaspora and the Congressional Black Caucus. Starting with Africa's quest for the security and governance kingdom, The threat of foreign intervention in the heart of Africa was tragically symbolized by the martyrdom of prophetic Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba in 1961. This led to a recognition of the need for what Kenya's Ali Mazrui described as a Pax Africana, a peace made, consolidated, and cultivated by Africans themselves. Africa's independence new kings basically stressed the inviolability of borders and sought instead to entrench their own positions behind the shield of sovereignty. Military marabouts, the men on horseback, rode onto the African political stage, and between 1960 and 1990, you had 72 military coups, urging citizens to stay by their radios while they basically staged coups d'etats that distorted politics. But despite the illusion of military magic, the soldiers were no more successful than civilians at transforming societies and economies. In retrospect, Africa's post-independence monarchs did not do enough to reverse the blighted legacy of colonialism and to develop indigenous systems for managing diversity constructively, something South Sudanese scholar-diplomat Francis Denk has written about insightfully. One of the early prophetic champions of African democracy was the only Black Nobel Peace winner in economics, St. Lucia's Fabian intellectual William Arthur Lewis, who served as the economic advisor to Kwame Nkrumah, ironically one of the early pioneers of one-party rule. Already in the 1960s, Lewis was insightfully calling for multi-party democracy in Africa's diverse states, involving proportional representation, coalition government, and federalist evolution. There are some grounds, though, for optimism in the quest for the democratic kingdom. Regular elections now take place across Africa. The technology-wielding youths of the Afro-Arab uprising famously toppled mummified pharaohs in Egypt, in Libya, and Tunisia in 2011. And alternance of political party has basically occurred in countries like Ghana, Senegal, Zambia, and Nigeria. The presence of the first African-American, Barack Obama, as we heard in the White House, has continued, sadly, in the malign tradition of his 43 predecessors. Obama reinforced, rather than challenged, the idea of France and Britain basically being left to oversee former spheres of influence in Africa. And serious questions must be posed about the Kenyan Kansan's commitment to democratic governance in countries such as Egypt, Uganda, Rwanda, and Chad. In the second quest for the socio-economic kingdom, though the percentage of Africans living in absolute poverty has fallen since 2000 from 58% to 41%, most of the poorest economic performers in the UN's Human Development Index remain African countries. In his famous 1972 treatise, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, prophetic Guyanese scholar activist Walter Rodney bemoaned Africa's declining terms of trade, unequal exchange, and exploitation by European colonial powers and the US, which he argued had integrated African economies into capitalist systems on vastly unequal terms. Rodney thus called for African self-reliance and self-sustainability. His fellow socialist prophet, Samir Amin of Egypt, suggested that Africa delink itself from the liberal capitalist system in ways that would promote a genuine transition towards socialism. Nigerian scholar prophet Adebayo Adedeji was Africa's most renowned visionary of economic integration, and he basically came up with the ideas and was the chief architect of creating regional integration schemes in West, East, and Southern Africa, while championing, like Walter Rodney, Africa's collective self-reliance and self-sustainability. Like Adedeji, Malawian economist Thandika Mkandawire has been one of the most eloquent critics of the structural adjustment experiments of the World Bank and IMF in the 1980s and 1990s, which conducted cuts in education, health, and employment in an utterly unaccountable manner that often undermined democratic governance and fueled social unrest across Africa. One shining example of the possibility of socio-economic reform in Africa was provided by the first term of Nigerian diva and Iron Lady, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who served as finance minister between 2003 and 2006. She was the architect of the second largest debt deal with the Paris Club of Creditors and led a team of courageous reformers to tackle corruption in Nigeria. The third and final magic kingdom that Africa and its diaspora have embarked on in the last 6 decades has been that of cultural equality. Pan-Africanism called for African unity so that these cultures might flourish unhampered by the denigrating influences of Western civilization. So in the Francophone world, writers like Martinique's Aimé Césaire and Senegal's Léopold Senghor developed the idea of negritude, which glorified black culture, looking back nostalgically at a rich African past. As Aimé Césaire noted, "My negritude is no tower and no cathedral. It delves into the deeper red flesh of the soil." Wole Soyinka, of course, ridiculed what he saw as the timidity of this approach, noting that a tiger does not declare its tigritude, it pounces. Africa and its diaspora have made great strides over the past 6 decades in efforts to achieve cultural equality. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s was an era of incredible artistic creativity that produced great prophetic prophets like Langston Hughes, much quoted by Thabo Mbeki. The post-independence era also produced 6 Nobel Literature Laureates from Africa and its diaspora. Wole Soyinka, Egypt's Naguib Mahfouz, South Africa's Nadine Gordimer and J.M. Coetzee, and the diaspora